Hi there, this is Mark Levy, your sourdough simpleton, back with another recipe for me to make here while you make it there. Now, we've made bread in the past, we've made crackers, we've even fried up some sourdough starter for a pancake. But this is a little bit different. We're going to make a chocolate cake. Now, this recipe is from the King Arthur Baking website, but I'm going to modify it a little bit and I'll show you what I mean about that in a few seconds. To begin with, we're going to use the first three ingredients. We're going to use 1 cup or 227 grams of sourdough starter. Now, this can be a fresh starter or this can be your discard. When I got my starter out this morning, it looked a little bit old, had some hooch on top, so I poured that off, and that's what we're using, a discard starter for this. Always good to have a recipe to use discard, right? We're going to use 2 cups or about 241 grams of all-purpose flour. Once again, I'm using the King Arthur unbleached, got that word out, all-purpose flour. And the original recipe called for 8 ounces or 227 grams of milk. And instead of using milk, we're going to use almond milk to keep this recipe non-dairy. So we're going to mix those 3 ingredients together to start out with, and then we'll talk about what we do after that. So here we have our mixing bowl, and to this we're going to add our starter, which is a little bit on the old side, a little bit stiff, but that's okay. And we're going to add our 8 ounces of almond milk. We'll mix that up a little bit just to kind of get it into the starter. And then we're going to add the flour. Again, this is 2 cups of flour, roughly 241 grams of all-purpose flour. And we're going to add it in little bits and starts just to get it incorporated into a batter. Now, this won't be a complete batter, certainly, but it is the beginning of the cake. After we finish mixing this all together, we're going to do what most sourdough recipes do, give it some time to rise. In this case, about 2 or 3 hours. Now, it's not going to double in size. It may not even show signs of active bubbling, but it will combine into a batter, and it will produce a really delicious chocolate cake. I know you're doubting me, but trust me, it's going to work. So, we're going to get this all incorporated together, cover it with some plastic wrap, and set it aside for a couple of hours to sit and autolyse the flour and combine the ingredients and see how it turns out. So that's what she looks like right now. We'll see you in about 2 or 3 hours. So it's been a bit longer than 2 hours. The batter that we mixed up is rising, and now it's time to mix up the other half of this recipe. So for this part of the recipe, which is the chocolate part, we're going to begin by using 1½ cups, which is about 298 grams of plain old-fashioned granulated sugar. We're going to use 1 cup or 198 grams of vegetable oil, any kind you like. We're going to use 2 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. We're going to use 1 teaspoon of salt, uniodized, of course. 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, not powder, baking soda. That's important. We may talk about that in a few minutes as a little sidebar. 3/4 cup, which is about 64 grams of natural cocoa. This is not Dutch processed. This is regular natural cocoa. And finally, to enhance the flavor a bit, 1 teaspoon of espresso powder. Now, we'll let you have a look at that one, as you can see it. And let's start mixing this up now. So with a plain old-fashioned spatula, we're going to start to mix this up. And I think you can appreciate the fact that it's not exactly going to come together as a smooth batter. So I think I'm going to help your viewing along by, let's say, speeding up the video a little bit. So I think you can see here, this is a little bit on the grainy side. That's because sugar does not dissolve in oil. And there's no water in here to dissolve the sugar. But the first thing we're going to do is add 2 eggs, one at a time. These are large eggs. Is there a difference between large eggs and other eggs? Well, yes, there is. We're going to mix these in. Could have done these one at a time, but I put them both in at the same time, which hopefully won't be too much of a problem. And once again, we're going to mix these all in thoroughly. And now we have even more of a grainy bowl of batter. But now we're going to add in our sourdough starter mixture that we had prepared from a couple of hours ago. Let's get that. So you may recall how this looked a couple of hours ago. It was much smaller and not quite as fluffy looking. So what we're going to do now is gradually introduce our chocolate mixture into the sourdough bowl. And mix that through. Now, when you start out doing this, the starter is still a little bit on the sticky side. And it's actually a bit of a gloppy mess, to use King Arthur's words. And I agree, it's a bit of a gloppy mess. But as we add more, it's going to come together as a batter. So after a few minutes of stirring, this has come together into a very, very nice, very rich looking chocolate batter. So now we're going to bake it. So I have a 9 by 13 cake pan, which I have greased, and we're just going to put this batter into it. Getting every delicious drop of batter into this pan. Okay. And we'll shake it a bit to make sure it's into all the corners. And there we have our batter for the chocolate cake. This will go into an oven at 350 degrees for about a half an hour until a toothpick inserted in the middle comes out dry. And then we'll see how this looks. So we'll catch you on the other side of the oven with this delicious sourdough chocolate cake. So while the cake is baking, let me take a few seconds to go back about something that I kind of alluded to but didn't really explain while we were making the cake. This cake uses cocoa, plain natural cocoa. There's another kind of cocoa which is called Dutch processed. Here are 2 cans of Hershey brand cocoa, which I got at my local Mega Mart. Yet one's bigger than the other, but the big difference is the type of cocoa. So this large one is natural cocoa. It is the pure cocoa as it comes out of the bean. They grind it up and they process it to make cocoa. It's unsweetened and it makes great cakes. But the other kind of cocoa is called Dutch cocoa. Now this Hershey Special is, if you look at the label, tells you that it's Dutch processed cocoa. What that means is that it's been treated with an alkali. Cocoa by nature is acidic, and by treating it with an alkali, you neutralize the acid-base balance of that chocolate, which is good for certain kinds of recipes. However, if we want to make a cake, and that cake needs leavening to rise, along with the sourdough, we put in baking soda. Baking soda is an alkali. Combine that with the acidic chocolate, the acidic cocoa, and you're going to get carbon dioxide bubbles, which will help the cake to rise. If you use Dutch processed cocoa, which is neutral, you won't get any rise out of that. You can use Dutch processed with baking powder, which has its own leavening in it, but you want to go with the kind of chocolate that the recipe calls for. If it doesn't say anything about it, like maybe an old recipe from, your grandmother or something, just use the regular cocoa and you'll be doing okay. For candy making, for some other things, I make a great hot fudge, for example. Dutch processed is the way to go. So a little bit about chocolate and cocoa, and now you know the difference between regular and Dutch processed cocoa. All right, so I raised the issue and you thought you were done with me for this segment, but you're not. Because during the cake making phase, I mentioned that we used large eggs. And I specified a large egg. And you might say, well, what's that all about? So, just for the sake of argument, this is a large egg, and this is an extra large egg. And maybe you can tell the difference when I'm holding it. This one's a little bit more oval shape, so maybe it looks a little bit bigger. But you may say, well, that's just the shape of the egg. But in fact, there is a significant difference. If I weigh this large egg on my convenient little scale here with a cup so it doesn't roll over, this tells me it's 60 grams. If I weigh the extra large egg, it's 65 grams. Doesn't sound like a lot, but after all, 5 grams is a teaspoon of liquid measurement, so it does make a difference. When you're cooking, a recipe, a pot roast or a stew or something where you use eggs, I don't know where you use eggs anyway, where you use eggs, it's not that much of a difference. But when you're baking, it really does make a difference. Certainly in bread making and cake baking, it does make a difference. So if a recipe does not specify what size of eggs, you should assume large. If it does specify, use what they tell you. So a little bit more about eggs and cocoa, and it's almost time to get the cake out of the oven. Well, it's been the half hour. The cake is out of the oven. Took 30 minutes, put in a toothpick, it was dry. I want to show you what this cake looks like. Is that gorgeous or what? Let's have a taste, why don't we? So we're going to cut a little corner of this cake. Comes out of the pan very easily because it was nicely greased. And there's to take a look at that crumb. And let's taste it. That is some kind of good cake. You would never know this was made with sourdough. It's moist, it's got nice fluff to it, it's got a deep chocolate taste. Fantastic. Check it out for yourself. We'll put the recipe attached to the listing, and we'll see what happens next time right here on the Sourdough Simpleton.